the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we are going to analyse 3 areas that have been relied on to protect New Zealanders from terror-styled attacks, legal measures that are designed to protect communities from danger and even protect individuals from themselves. The background to this episode is the tragic, terrifying attacks that were committed against unarmed innocent people at West Auckland's LynnMall Countdown supermarket by Mr Samsudeen, and we'll refer to Mr Samsudeen throughout this episode for many different reasons. But in the first instance, the attacks occurred last Friday, September the 3rd, 2021. It ended with the hospitalisation of 7 people and the death of Mr Samsudeen, who was fatally shot by Special Tactics police officers during his attempt to kill and injure as many people as he could. Within the days of the attacks, we learned that Mr Samsudeen was a troubled man, with some psychologists describing him of suffering mental illness. He was a refugee who sought asylum here in New Zealand after experiencing, through his formative years, civil war and ethnic cleansing in Sri Lanka, who, at the age of 20 years of age, arrived in New Zealand on a student visa and then sought asylum. He was eventually granted refugee status and since then has spent years in prison on various charges and convictions, largely involving the possession of terrorist material seeded on the internet by ISIS and threats showing intent to commit terrorist acts against New Zealanders. In today's episode, Paul Buchanan and I will examine questions as to whether or not this tragedy could have been prevented, and will consider New Zealand's security and terror laws, deportation laws involving those with refugee status, and the Mental Health Act, and whether this was available to authorities. We will also analyse whether it is necessary for the New Zealand government to move to tighten New Zealand's terror security laws, and if it does, how the intended new laws compare to other Five Eyes member countries. Okay, let's cross to Paul to unpack all of this tragic and serious issue. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good, Selwyn. How are you?
Yeah, kia ora. Tēnā koe, Paul. Very good, ka pai. Thank you very much. Paul, let's start right at the beginning here. That what we saw was the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, coming out and identifying and defining Mr Samsudeen as a terrorist, and that this was a terrorist act committed by an individual, not as a representative of any religion, creed or grouping. What did you make of it in the first instance? And then can you take us through your thinking over the next 24 hours after hearing of this last Friday, Paul?
Yeah, it's a big subject. I must say that I'm a little discomforted by the fact that nearing the anniversary of September 11th, here we are, you and I, talking about terrorism in New Zealand, although I'll explain why I don't think this particular act rose to the level of a terrorist event. I was hoping that we'd be able to talk about, some other comparative politics type of thing, but here we are. Terrorism 20 years after 9/11, and terrorism at home. And so, again, purported terrorism. I found the rush by the Prime Minister and other pundits on the day of the event to label this fellow a terrorist and to dump all of the baggage that goes with it on him now that he was dead, to be a serious red flag. It seemed too hasty. it almost seemed out of character for our Prime Minister, who is normally very judicious in how she parses phrases. You know, the talking heads, the so-called experts, many of whom have a vested interest in, you know, seeing anything terroristic as a nail that they need to hammer. I didn't pay much mind to them. They had nothing new to say. You know, the usual lone wolf, blah, blah, blah. But the Prime Minister, that bothered me, because what she's done is she's framed the debate about that event. And it turns out the backdrop to that includes her government trying to pass amendments to the Terrorism Suppression Act, the main anti-terrorist law in this country, to expand the powers of the state with regards to surveillance, seizure, and control into the area of planning and preparing for a terrorist event. Now,
before we get into into that part, shall we just bring up for the audience exactly what we're talking about in that announcement, and then move into the next part relating to how do you define terrorism and a terrorist, and whether or not the Prime Minister was, you know, accurate and correct in this respect.
He stabbed 6 people at a supermarket. The government's calling it an ISIL-inspired attack. Authorities say the attacker was a Sri Lankan national who'd been in the country since 2011 and was on a security watch list. Video posted online showed panic shoppers fleeing the scene are in a critical condition.
What happened today was despicable. It was hateful. It was wrong. It was carried out by an individual, not a faith, not a culture, not an ethnicity, but an individual person who was gripped by ideology that is not supported here by anyone or any community. He alone carries the responsibility for these acts. Let that be where the judgment falls.
So, Paul, what the Prime Minister was talking about there was basically defining this specifically from the point of view of not allowing, in her view, this debate to wash over into Islamophobia, and that she is trying to pull out religion, she's trying to pull out faith that people may subscribe to out of the mix, but has labelled this individual as having supported and practicing a doctrine of ISIS, of which is not welcome here. And in that way she labelled him and said he was a terrorist and that this was a terrorist act. Now over to you, Paul, from the point of view of, I know, for example, that you have written a very strong piece on Kiwi Politico, and where you define exactly
after 2:30 there were people running, there were
define exactly what terrorism is and whether or not this individual came into it. Can you talk this through? And I'll bring it up on screen as soon as we've got a clear audio of that, Paul.
Well, what we missed from the Prime Minister's clip is that the 4th or 5th word out of her mouth after she got onto that podium was the word terrorist. Again, she framed the entire thing as a lone wolf terrorist act. And that was the red flag to me. I'm like, we're not sure. I also would contrast the caution that she and other government officials used with regards to the Christchurch killer in the immediate aftermath of the massacres in Christchurch on March 15th, 2019. There was a lot of talk about not rushing to judgment, that they couldn't be certain what the motivation was. Now remember, that killer published a manifesto online in the lead up to the attack. So that was running in my mind when I saw it. And what also was running in my mind, and some of our listeners may not know this, but you of course well do, is that I have some familiarity with this topic dating back to a previous life in government service. So I'm not just someone who shows up and gives an opinion. I actually I think about these things regularly. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Terrorism, to define it very simply, has a target, which are the immediate victims of the event, usually soft targets, innocents. You know, you go for the most outrageous target, if you will. But then there is a subject, which is the wider audience that you're trying to influence. And that audience can be the general public, it can be an adversary group, it can be the government, it can even be like-minded people. You're trying to impress like-minded people the way the Christchurch killer did. So your audiences, your subjects are multiple. And then there's the object, which is to say, what's the point? The point is to deliver a message to those audiences. Now, if you look at the Christchurch killer, all of those things obtained. He took a highly symbolic target, people worshiping in mosques on the day of prayer, on a highly symbolic date, the Ides of March. He amassed weapons in secrecy. He methodically planned, meticulously organized his attacks, and then he live streamed the whole thing to his audiences after publishing his manifesto. That is a lone wolf terrorist attack if we believe that he had no enablers or accomplices. Now let's look at Mr. S, as he was known to the police at the time. He had publicly threatened a judge, had repeatedly stated his intention to kill infidels. He had voiced displeasure with the situation, not only the situation of Muslims in New Zealand, but his own personal situation. He was mingling the two. He was very open about his hatreds. And to the point that when he was released, the police didn't buy the idea that he could be rehabilitated. They put an armed squad 24/7 on him because maybe the judge was not as concerned that he was a violent threat to society and himself, but the police sure did. And so they were tailing him. He goes into the supermarket, he grabs a knife off a shelf, and he starts stabbing anyone who gets close to them. But he's running around the supermarket yelling and screaming. So he's not stopping to deliver a second blow on anybody. He's just
with that. So that description there is really important. That's exactly how we understand the tragedy and the events of last Friday occurred. From the average Kiwi's point of view, of the average audience point of view, would they see this act that was committed and the method, the way that you've described it, any different perhaps to those that we believe were terrorist acts in London on the bridge a few years ago, where people ran out and there was a knife? There's an element of creating terror. Is there a difference between a terrifying act and a terrorist act?
Yes, you just encapsulated. Let me just roll the script a little further. This man acted impulsively and opportunistically. He saw the moment to get the knife, unlike the London Bridge guys who brought knives to the equation. And by the way, right now the trial of the Bataclan terrorists has just begun in France. 20 individuals who organized armed convoys and attacked the Bataclan and its surroundings, 6 or 7 years ago. That's a terrorist act. But this guy operated, there was no pre-planning as far as anyone can tell. He acted opportunistically. He acted rather than coldly and calculatingly, he acted in a white-hot rage. It'd be almost as if he was stabbing someone in a lover's quarrel. And he did so impulsively to the point that he alerted people to his presence. So people were able to run from him because they could hear the shouting and screaming. And of course, he alerted the police who were out of sight. They were more concerned about not revealing themselves to him, particularly with the level 4 lockdown going on. And so it took them a little while to get into the aisle where they finally located him and shot him. My point is, by any measure of the definition of terrorism, this did not rise to the level of a terrorist attack. You're absolutely right. With regards to consequence, it was terrifying for everybody there. But if we're going to get into arguing about consequences as the definition, let's think of it this way. The Bataclan, or the Christchurch killer, had worldwide reverberations and influenced the way counterterrorism strategy is conducted globally. This attack on Friday night, Saturday night, Thursday night was the front lead item in the news. Last night, on one of the leading channels in New Zealand, it didn't even figure. And in the second one, it was relegated to 20 minutes into the show. So I would argue that both with regards to preparation, with regards to consequence, this was a hate crime. It's heinous, but it was a hate crime. Now, you may say, but Paul, there are no hate crime statutes in New Zealand. And I'd say, yes, you're exactly right. That doesn't mean that it's not a hate crime, just because there's not a law that defines it. Hate crimes are usually, we refer to them as a violent attack on an individual or group because of who they are. Gay people, people of color, redheads. Okay. But in this case, the man's hatred was for infidels, for non-Muslims, for society at large. And so I would say, yes, it's a bit of a broad definition of a hate crime, but using it more accurately reflects what went down on Friday afternoon in that supermarket. And so once I reflected upon it, I thought, this is really bad that the media has taken up the Prime Minister's characterization absolutely uncritically, reflexively. It's just, lone wolf terrorist. Without understanding there are agendas at play. The government now is going to pass the amendment to the Terrorism Suppression Act under urgency. They're going to ride the wave of public opinion and get this law passed to now include planning and preparing a terrorist act. And let me explain the difficulty there. Just to finalize my concerns about that expansion of state powers. Out here in the hills of West Auckland, we have a serious wasp problem in the summer. And the best way to kill off wasp nests, we're talking 100,000 wasps, is to fill wine bottles with petrol, with gasoline, put a rag in the top, and stick them in the holes that lead underground into the nest. So they look like Molotov cocktails. Now imagine if the authorities were listening to me talk to my neighbor about stockpiling 20 to 30 bottles so that we could go over our lifestyle properties doing this. And they listen and they think he's up to no good. They're going to launch a Molotov attack. They're planning and preparing a terrorist attack. Well, they'd be embarrassed when they finally arrive at my house and discover it was used for wasp eradication. But that's my point. How do you define the planning and preparing of a terrorist act? And I find that the using this Friday event as a justification for expanding the powers of the state in the area of so-called terrorism under urgency to be disingenuous at best and anti-democratic at worst.
Look, and with respect to the definitions of terrorism, let's have a look at exactly what the government's representative, for example here, the New Zealand Securities Intelligence Service, New Zealand SIS Director Rebecca Kitteridge, she defined terrorist acts as being, and this is before parliamentary committee on such things, she defined terrorist acts as being, and I quote here, violent extremism motivated by political beliefs, identity, faith, or a single issue. Now there is obviously scope for debate there, but it does seem that this individual perhaps did not fit that stated claim of definition that is coming out of the New Zealand SIS Director Rebecca Kitteridge's own view here. And And I would argue, Paul, that definition is what the NZSIS actually uses to weigh and consider whether or not an individual is a terrorist and what exactly is a terrorist act. Now, why we're getting down to these definitions is clearly to try and understand what laws the New Zealand authorities had at their disposal that could have protected New Zealanders and also Mr Samsudeen from himself. With respect to the New Zealand SIS director here and that definition, I wonder, Paul, is that a reason why the New Zealand SIS did not issue a security risk certificate against Mr S for the very reason it didn't believe that his situation fitted the definition of terrorism?
Yeah, you're a wise fellow, I'll tell you, asking that particular question. Hey, let me just say, Selwyn, what Director Kitteridge was referring to is what we call non-state actor ideological terrorism. There are many types of terrorism. The most common is state terrorism. State terrorism done in peacetime, let's say against its own citizens, like the dictatorships that I lived under in Argentina and Chile. Terrorism in wartime, like the firebombing of Dresden, which served no military purpose, but was designed to terrorize the German people. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had little military utility, but were designed to psychologically break the will of the Japanese people into surrender, and it worked. You see, terrorism works. There is state-sponsored terrorism. Let's say, for example, the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah or Hamas, where you use proxies to do dirty deeds on your behalf. There is criminal terrorism. You know, the mafia kills people in order to terrorize the surrounding community. So we're focusing on a particular type of terrorism in the wake of 9/11. Right now, everything, this growth industry known as the terrorism studies industry, of which there are exemplars in this country, is all about non-state actor ideological terrorism. But then the question begs, what is the depth of the ideology? You know, it's not so much the nature, right wing versus left wing, religious versus secular, but what is the ideological depth of the perpetrators? Because people have many motivations to ascribe to a cause. And that's where I think you're onto something. This man glommed on to ISIS, but he had no network connections with ISIS. He had no real religious fervor, not only before he came to New Zealand, but afterwards. He just started getting into extremist literature, beheading videos. I won't get into, violent young men and their games, but it seems that maybe his ideological conviction was either not as deep as true Wahhabists and Salafists, or it was part of his mental affliction. Now, I'm not a mental health guy. I'm not going down that route. But I think that what was interesting was, and gave wisdom to your comment, is that our intelligence services, 20 years after 9/11, confronted not only with other acts of terrorism and their own mistakes in the past when it came to defining who was a terrorist, decided to not invoke the easiest tool they had in their toolbox when it comes to a foreign-born person, which is the security risk certificate, in order to turn him around. They decided against that.
And it has been used before in this country. When Ahamed Aathill arrived way back into the latter part of 2003, by beginning of 2004, the SIS issued a New Zealand security risk certificate against the individual on the belief that he represented a terrorist group from overseas, even though it was found later to be false information. Black flag operations had been there to soil his reputation for political reasons, and also the New Zealand SIS was eventually found a way to allow the man to be free. But remember, when Ahamed Aathill arrived here seeking asylum, he had never obviously spoken a word of violent intent in his life. He was banged up in solitary confinement in prison in New Zealand, pending the outcome of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security investigations or hearings into his case, which took years to get there. What on earth was stopping the New Zealand SIS from issuing a security risk certificate against Mr S? And I wonder, Paul, if it is because he did not fit, despite how terrifying his intent was, he didn't fit the definitions of the SIS's definitions of terrorist and terrorism.
Yeah, well, you and I have some familiarity with the Zoe case. I would say with the SIS, it's probably a case of once burnt, twice shy. I mean, Zoe, they were trying to frame Zoe. I mean, I'm not going to mince words here. It was a despicable act on the part of the SIS and the government of the day to frame an innocent guy in order to curry favor with other governments in the post 9/11 environment. This fellow fit the bill. I mean, he fit the bill. My understanding is that he started to show signs of violence, and again, interpersonal as well as ideological, during the time he was seeking refugee status. In fact, he wasn't happy with the slow process of being granted refugee status. There's some claims that his application might have been fraudulent, but whatever the case was, he was starting to show signs of a tendency towards violence. And that continued. That continued then for the ensuing years up until Friday. At any point, because he was foreign born, he didn't have citizenship, they could have applied the security risk certificate, and then they'd have to figure out what to do with him, but they could have kept him confined had they done so. I mean, that's the key here, is he presented, for whatever reason, a clear and present threat to society and himself. He himself said that. Yeah. And yet he was released because he had been in jail too long. In fact, longer than he wound up what the sentencing guidelines would be.
Look, now, Paul, I think just at that point, sorry, we've got a bit of a lag going here.
Yeah, I was just going to contrast the reluctance to use the security risk certificate in the second instance, because it would have been the second instance. But let's contrast this with another strange case involving the Crown. In 2007, 18 people were picked up in the Urewera Mountains and initially charged under the Terrorism Suppression Act. And after litigation, it was the courts decided that running around in the bush playing at Che Guevara does not rise to the level of being a terrorist. Violent talk, they were talking about launching a bus onto a presidential motorcade. It didn't matter what the state of mind of these people were. They had not committed an act of violence, and so they couldn't be charged under the TSA. You would have thought that the Crown would not go back and try to test the TSA again in an area where it was not designed to go. What happens? We have, in this instance, they tried to charge this man with offenses of planning and preparing a terrorist act under the Terrorism Suppression Act, even though there was no such clauses, no such language in the act about planning and preparation.
So on that point, it highlights that element of perceived weakness. And I'll just steer back from that a little bit too, from the point of view of, at some point, there's a fork in the road on decisions. There are three acts, arguably, that the authorities could have used in a preventative kind of measure. And that was obviously the Terrorism Suppression Act Security Act. There's obviously Immigration Act, and there's a Mental Health Act here in New Zealand. Now, if we look at the SIS earlier in the game, it's obviously working in tandem with the police. One gets a sense the police were the lead agency on this, but security elements and security sensitivities are very, very acute in this case. We can see that from the information of which has been released to the public since last Friday. At some point, I wonder, and I don't want to sound like a dog with a bone on this, Paul, there's that wonderful word but, with the SIS, I wonder that at the point where they may have been considering what avenues were available to them from the point of view of issuing a security risk certificate to legally hold this man in custody until such time as he either is no longer a threat or he remains in custody until the day that he basically dies under that type of part of New Zealand law that exists today and has existed for some time. I wonder at that point, when that is, clearly it would have been under consideration and debate, that the testimonies and the advisories that were coming in from psychologists both in New Zealand and in Australia, from Australia, that were arguing that, and understandably, that this individual had suffered extreme experiences, if not personally. He certainly was raised and observed the killing fields of Sri Lanka in the northern parts of the country. He witnessed what we know now from history as ethnic cleansing that was taking place in his place of state of origin. We know that torture exists and continues to exist for those that oppose the government in Sri Lanka's iron will and such things. And it seems that the psychologists were saying that we had in our midst here in New Zealand a disturbed and even, some of them are saying, ill individual that explains his behaviour and also explains his reliance on ISIS ideologies to frame his hate in some way. And I wonder if the SIS were thinking, this is too clouded, we don't want a 7-year litigation that takes us through the courts and says after all that time, once again, we've issued a security risk certificate against an individual who they end up saying is mentally ill. So if we bring into the debate at this point a look at what is available from the point of view of people that have looked at it from a legal point of view, and I'm not talking about trying to apply any stigma on people who are suffering mental illness. This act is one that stands away from all of that. Obviously, people suffering mental illness, we all suffer a degree of mental illness through our lives. And the stigmas that were applied to such illnesses in the past is just ridiculous, and the wonderful work that has gone on to strip this country of stigma so that people can stand tall and proud irrespective of what kind of illness they have. It needs to be applauded. We're talking about the law here, aren't we, Paul? And I'll just bring up on screen here, with that kind of explanation behind us, an article that has been published via The Conversation and republished on Evening Report by Chris Gledhill, who's a professor of law at Auckland University of Technology. Now, Chris talks down here, and I've just highlighted a piece here, that there was a psychiatric report for the 2018 sentencing decision which records various symptoms of mental illness, but it does not appear there was an updated report in 2021. Further investigations should ask whether this was an avenue that should have been used. Now that's an important line coming from a legal perspective here. And we do know that there is scope within the Mental Health Act relating to the elements of an individual who is expressing behaviours that may be a danger to the general public and to themselves. So we think, okay, well, this guy fits into that. There still hasn't been, I don't believe, Paul, a robust analysis of that point that indeed is coming through from Chris Gledhill. Also, there is a another part that Chris Gledhill identifies here too, and I'll just read that in quotations again. Mental health legislation may have been more relevant in this case, and the fact it wasn't used calls for an investigation. As it was, the only power available was for the police to carry out a surveillance operation complete with armed officers. This suggests they viewed the man as a clear and present danger. So we're coming back in circles here. There are warnings that are coming through from the legal fraternity. We know, Paul, from the point of view of testimony that was given to the courts going back through 2018 by a Dr. Clark, who has been well reported in New Zealand media over the last few days, of saying that his advisories were indeed very much that the Mental Health Act and elements of defining the state of mind that this individual, Mr S, was in, should be taken into consideration. I think that's a fairly accurate paraphrase of it, Paul. But I know you've written extensively, you've given many, many hours of thought relating to whether or not that route could have been and ought to have been taken in this case of Mr S. Can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, and I will say that you never want an intelligence agency to make the final call on the disposition of an individual case. Intelligence agencies are there to provide information to decision makers, and democracies, politically elected decision makers. So security risk certificates, they need to be issued by the government, not by the intelligence agency. Those, because it's a political decision when you do so. So I just wanted to say that, that the idea that the intel agencies will make a call on somebody, like, you can recommend, but, let the authorities, the people that we've entrusted with the responsibility of governance, let them make that call.
So that would be the ideal, but as we know from the Zoe case, the New Zealand SIS issued their security risk certificate.
Exactly, and I would have hoped that we would have changed the rules and regulations governing the issuance of security risk. But here's the thing, it is absolutely clear that the bar for declaring someone, unfit, so that they will be subject to compulsory treatment orders under the Mental Health Act, that bar has to be extremely high, extremely high. It has to be subject to checks and balances of a clinical sort, and it has to be subject to regular review, because that avoids politicization. It avoids basically arbitrary and capricious application of the Mental Health Act. I'm 100%, down with that. On the other hand, under what conditions does a individual merit preventative detention? To put it bluntly, I'm not going to use the fineries of mental health, rhetoric, and just say, when do you keep people confined against their will, without them having been, sentenced or imprisoned as a result of a crime? And I would say, in the event that they pose a clear and present threat to the public as well as themselves, and until such a time as they can be clinically evaluated. That, I think, is reasonable criteria. And obviously, the individual involved, in this case, Mr. S, would need advocates at his side all along the way. But I don't think authorities go into this in an arbitrary and capricious manner. I think that they take their duties seriously. And so even though he may have not met the threshold of a clinically diagnosed condition, let's say like schizophrenia, he clearly presented a danger to society. And there were ongoing questions about his deterioration while in prison. There were no questions, certainly not in the police's mind, about what he intended to do when he got out. He said so. He absolutely broadcast.
And told the judge in no uncertain terms the same thing.
He threatened that judge. He said in the courtroom that he was going to do harm to Kiwis. I mean, I think right there, that goes to the heart of his state of mind. He's in court.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they felt that the way they had chosen to go, which was down the national security route. See, they gave up on trying to apply the Mental Health Act, and they said that it was because it was not realistic because he didn't meet the threshold. Now, I'd like a little further explanation as to the reasoning. But once
you're not alone on that. You've got other professors of law who are calling for the inquiries to look into exactly that point. They know the definitions in the Mental Health Act. Obviously, from a legal point of view, they believe that it comes into scope. The reasons need to be explained as to why not.
Yeah, but then you've got your choices are you either treat him as a mental health patient who is where the ideology, his penchant for violence, what does someone say? His homicidal ideation is not deeply rooted in ideology. That's what he opportunistically glommed onto to justify his miserable existence and how to get out of it.
And that's supported by psychologist analysis going back about 3 years, isn't it?
Apparently. Now, again, someone told me to not stray from my lane.
Yeah, swim in your lane, Paul. I've been watching the Olympics. You keep into your lane. So.
I was going to say, I'm not real good at, having grown up in Argentine traffic, let me say that staying in a lane is not part of the Buchanan psyche. But getting back to the serious issue, a decision was made at some point that they're not going to treat Mr. S as a mental health case. They are going to treat him as a national security case. And that's why I always bring up the analogy of a hammer and nails. To security people, all sorts of people like this are nails that need to be hammered down. And so they couldn't get him on actual crimes. Again, he was sentenced for 2 counts of possessing objectionable materials, i.e. jihadist literature and whatnot. He served 3 years while his trials were pending. His immigration case, getting back to trying to remove him, that is pending. That was still being litigated. And the judge decided to release him because the judge was confident that he could be rehabilitated, and yet no rehabilitation program was in place when he was released. And even though he was ordered into compulsory psychiatric examination, he refused, so they gave up. It turns out if you're the patient and you refuse to be evaluated, you walk.
Yeah, so, that's a nonsense in a sense that we know that in practice that is not the case. So it can't be used as an excuse here. Also, there's a difference between psychological assessment and psychiatric assessment. And I think that's where, the knowledgeable people in the elements of law and what was available under that Act are drawing into that particular area of scope and how it could be applied. Now, what we've detailed here is clearly at some point there's a fork in the road. The decisions have been made by the police prosecutions to follow the security route, applying in that respect. They've got to the courts. The courts have said, no. There's no provision within these particular charges that allows us to actually detain. He's already been in prison on remand, etc., for so long. He's basically got to be let out. So the laws that were being pursued and put before the courts were failing. Once again, I would stress that there were other elements of New Zealand law issuing by the SIS a security risk certificate would have achieved that goal. But for whatever reason, we think we need an explanation from the government and the SIS as to why that wasn't applied. But the police are the lead agencies here. They do not get what they want. So they then actually wrap around because they know this guy is, he's clearly ready to, he's like a grenade waiting to go off in a sense, isn't he? He's in the community. He is deeply disturbed. He is angry to the core. There is something that came on, Paul, and you touched on it in your Kiwi Politico piece that came out yesterday, and that was relating to a caseworker that was assigned to him, that he developed some sort of fixation with, to the point where that individual, she had to be taken off his case. That occurred only a matter of days, if I am correct, before all of this went awry. And I wonder psychologically, in a reasonably minded evaluation of that, and I'm not talking a clinical evaluation here, but a reasonably minded one, is that the kind of trigger that can send a person who is unstable, who is angry, who has a heightened sense of victimization and wants to kick out and destroy anything else? Is that the kind of thing that can trip a person off, do you think?
Yeah, it does. And, it's not an uncommon syndrome, to be honest with you, particularly with alienated young men. I mean, this fellow was socially isolated in the extreme. After he was arrested, because of his notoriety, he was not welcome even in the Sri Lankan community, much less the larger Muslim community. He was bailed to a mosque that didn't have an imam, but it did have a bed. So that's why he was sent there. But, so he was very isolated, very frustrated. Now, I would say this: we have to remember, and it's why I brought up the parallels between the Udaweda crowd and then the Crown trying to go after him under the TSA. Under the TSA, they couldn't go after him. The High Court's judge explained why, because there was no language in the TSA that dealt with planning and preparation. However, in the Crimes Act, there is language about planning and preparation. Let's think of it this way. The police have evidence that I am going to murder you. I don't like you anymore. I'm going to sneak over and do harm to you and whatever. They have evidence, compelling evidence. Do you think they're going to wait till I do the deed? Under the Crimes Act, no, they won't. They'll get that evidence. They'll arrest me. They'll present it to a judge, and I'll be convicted of conspiracy to murder. They could have used the Crimes Act. That's what's so galling about this. They decided to test the TSA yet again in court, on this guy, knowing they would lose. Because why? What was the intelligence of that? Because it will force a parliamentary vote on expanding the TSA.
Yeah. A legislative response. That's one of the concerns, but that's what we have seen materialise out of this, haven't we? So this event happens last Friday. Hot on the heels of that, we have an explanation that this guy was a bad guy, and he's a terrorist and terrorist act, that everything within our laws have not been able to address or apprehend or put him into custody that would prevent this kind of act from occurring and stop other New Zealanders from being injured or worse, killed once he explodes his rage into the community. So everything fails. The law isn't able, that's what we've been told, isn't able to address such things. Now we understand, and it is in train now, that the reform in the TSA has been sitting and going through the select committee process. It is ready to go, and under urgency, the government has an intent to change that. You'll be able to put it far better than me, but it basically allows them to, if the reforms went through and Parliament passed it, to actually apprehend a person on the suspicion that they are planning a terrorist act, to bring them into custody and to test that through the courts under that particular element. Is that correct?
That's what they're planning to do. I mean, you well know, Selwyn, that I have serious reservations about anti-terrorist legislation, because what it does is it elevates the ideological motivation and it downplays the crime. See, I believe that any acts of violence against individuals or collectivities, for whatever reason, are crimes, and they should be treated as such. For example, the Christchurch murderer was charged and convicted of 51 counts of murder and then 40 counts of grievous bodily harm, and he will serve the rest of his life in prison. There was no reason to bring up his motivation. I mean, maybe at his sentencing you would. Because of 9/11, not just here in New Zealand, but around the world, and in some places much worse than in New Zealand, we've created all of this body of law that criminalizes certain ideological or politically motivated thought as well as action. And so, today we may go after a jihadist, the next day we may go after a white supremacist, but we're now focused on why they did what they did or why they're planning what they're planning. And we're not focusing on what they want to do or what they did. And so, yes, they will get the expansion of the TSA to include language about planning and preparation. And quite frankly, I think that's a slippery slope. I think it's a very dangerous place to go. Remember, the Crimes Act has enough in it to deal with mass murder, to deal with planning for that sort of thing. And so I think we've missed the forest for the trees.
Yeah,
terrorists want us to treat them specially, to treat their crimes specially. That gives them mana, that enhances them in the eyes of their cohort.
Infamy in a sense as well, isn't it? And this is one of the concerns that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, has in naming by name individuals that have fallen into this category of terrorism, the March 15 mass murderer, for example.
But that's why I disagree. She fell into the trap of calling him a terrorist. She did so from the get-go. She didn't point, unlike the white guy, She immediately jumped up and said, oh, terrorist, this, that, and the other. None of the consideration that was given to, the Christchurch killer was given to this man. And I think, no, that's the problem. For all your talk about not giving the terrorists what they want, which is infamy, notoriety, you blurted out that he was a lone wolf terrorist in the first sentence of your press conference. We don't know what his mental state was. We don't know what precipitated. You mentioned because of concerns about confidentiality, we'll get into the identity of the individual that he developed a fixation with. But, there is a phenomenon known as affective displacement or affective transfer, where you transfer your fixation or your focus on an object of affection onto something else. And apparently he had jihad as a fixation, and then he shifted to an individual. That right there tells you that his ideological motivation is not that strong. He just shifted off to an individual. I don't know why he did that fixation, but let's say that it's because he was developing feelings for this person, to the point that the authorities decided to remove this person from his physical presence and told him so. Said, you're not seeing this person anymore. That happened apparently 2 days before the attacks. So it's very possible that that was the trigger for him to opportunistically grab a knife in the kitchenware section of a local supermarket. If so, then all this ideological stuff is unnecessary. We had a guy who needed treatment, who was acting out in various ways, and who never got the sort of remedies that would have prevented this short of shooting him.
Yeah. Now, there's one other law that obviously the government is considering reform on too, and that's relating to the refugee elements of immigration law and whether or not New Zealand would develop the right to arbitrarily send back a refugee or a person who has refugee status here in New Zealand back to their state of origin into the hands of those that perhaps arguably they've escaped from. But with respect to that, what I will do, Paul, is I will just make reference to some wonderful work that Andrew Geddes has written in exactly this space on Pundit, and that's pundit.co.nz. And Andrew is writing there, and his headline is, why not just send the Auckland terrorist back? And he is talking all about the reasons why New Zealand could not do that, that there is actual international law considerations that would prevent it. And he is saying here, and right at the bottom, Paul, he is making reference to if the New Zealand government does have intentions to allow that to occur, and I'll do a direct quote from Andrew's thinking here, this form of detention could very easily morph into indeterminate imprisonment of foreign-born terrorist suspects under the guise of immigration law, which may be a step that New Zealand wants to take. But if we're going to take it, let's be really clear about what we are going to do. So there's a lot for the audience to kind of unpick there, Paul, and to go into that. And before we get a last word from you, Paul, on where you believe the government should respond, let's just pick up a couple of comments that have come in from just a couple of people in the audience during this episode. Craig Burns, he's based in Australia, and he says the Prime Minister and government blamed the whole stuff on him when they knew about it 5 years earlier. That's unbelievable. And that's a response from one of the audience members there. There's also Liz Hughes. She is a frequent watcher of this program, and she makes reference to Mike Smith, who she's putting a comment in there where he is talking about the comparisons to other Five Eyes countries. For those that are on Facebook, I would suggest that they look at the comments there and engage with the comments and take the conversation broader if they so wish to. So thank you for those contributions coming in from the audience. Paul, over to you for a last word on this, and what do you believe the New Zealand government should do from the point of view of making this country a safer place for New Zealand community, but also for people in a situation like Mr. S?
Well, I'd say, that Andrew Geddes is a thoughtful guy, and I agree with him. We're a nation of laws. We're supposedly champions of human rights. Once you grant refugee status, you don't send people back to their country of origin. They left for a reason. And if it turns out that the person goes bad after they've been granted refugee status, you deal with it on your own. You own it. You made the mistake on letting them in and giving them refugee status. If there was a mistake, if someone becomes mentally ill years after they're granted citizenship or something of that sort, then it's then it's no one's fault, really, to be honest with you. But this idea that we send people back, this idea that we treat people who exhibit something other than ideological zealotry, which was clearly the case here, and we treat them in the cruelest manner possible, again, isolating them in prison, giving them no support structure. It turns out Mr. S was in the same wing of the maximum security prison that Ahamed Aathill had been put in, and where the Christchurch killer is currently incarcerated. So it wasn't as if he was getting much sunshine. My point simply is this. We're either a humane nation of laws that treats our people, including our imported people like myself, with the dignity that they deserve, even though they may have committed bad acts. I mean, the Australian has a certain level of dignity in prison. He's part of the population. But the point is, and to reply to Liz, we don't want to be like China. Don't dare compare New Zealand's legal approach to people who may have mental health issues with that of the Chinese. Please don't do that. That's what makes us different. We are objectively better. And in this case, we were not. We allowed concerns about security to override compassion and humanity in the treatment of someone who, in my unprofessional opinion, was clearly disturbed. And so what law changes may need to be made, I wouldn't make them to the Terrorism Suppression Act. Heck, I wouldn't even make them to the Immigration Act or the Crimes Act. I would make them to the Mental Health Act. So with the proper protocols in place, you can put someone who's at risk to themselves and society, objectively so, that is examined by people and whatnot, into preventative custody until such a time as they can be evaluated and given the treatment they so desperately need. Again, not arbitrary, not capricious, not done on a whim, not done for political reasons, not done for personal reasons, done to protect that person and society from himself. If we change the law along those lines, we'll be a better place.
Thank you for that contribution, Paul. I very much appreciate that, and for that last word. I would just add one element of that. And if legislative reform is going to come out of this tragedy, this terrifying act that occurred last Friday, then one would hope that sanity and logic would prevail, and the inquiry into all of the failures that went on here occurs first, and the recommendations that perhaps emerge from that inquiry would be a better position to develop legislative change upon. Until this time next week, we look forward to seeing you and having your company again. Thank you for your attendance. Take care. Goodbye.